Hello, welcome to this video series in which we're talking about two classic synths from the 70s and 80s, Sequential Circuits Prophet 5 and Prophet VS. The Prophet 5 was released in 1978. It's an analog subtractive synth and was littered throughout music of the late 70s and 80s. The Prophet VS was introduced nearly 10 years later and is the first example of vector synthesis, and we'll get to that later. They are two separate synths. They combine in this VST. Arturia have implemented them together and allow you to run them in hybrid mode, and you get some awesome kind of sounds from like Jean-Michel Jarre's Rendezvous or something. But we're not going to worry too much about the VS for now. We're going to take that away with these little buttons up at the top and switch to Prophet 5 mode. And we're just going to baby step our way through this synth, then we'll do the VS, and then we'll figure out how to plug them together. So as is always the case when I'm doing a synth deconstruction, I like to strip everything away to the absolute bare bones. In order to do that, we need to select one of its basic template programs. If we choose Pro 5 1 Osc, it's got some settings in here that I don't want. I want to get really down to absolute basics. So I'm just going to click a few of these buttons and turn a few things off. And as things stand right now, we have a single oscillator, sawtooth synthesizer that's going to produce a really, really simple tone. We can see the sawtooth in our oscillator, and we can see the classic sawtooth shape in span. Here is the button telling us that we have a sawtooth oscillator at the moment. If I turn that off and press the square wave button instead, this is the Prophet's interpretation of a square wave. Can you see it's not very square? If I very briefly switch over to the Hallion, that's Hallion's implementation of a square wave, much squarer. So that's the sound of a mathematically kind of correct square wave, if you like. But we're dealing with analog synths here. We don't really want things to be mathematically correct. We want them to be colourful. And one of the beauties of this synth and why it was so popular in the 70s and 80s is because its tone is so awesome. It was described as 5 mini-moogs in a box. It had 5-note polyphony, and out of this box, I suppose in deference to the original, the polyphony on this instrument is set to 5 in this little box down here. You can actually have 32-note polyphony, but we'll leave it at 5 for now. So here we've got square wave generator. Now, if you have a look at that oscilloscope, the positive values are as wide as the negative values. In other words, we have a 50% duty cycle. I don't particularly want to get too deep into the physics, but we're up 50% of the time and we're down 50% of the time, positive and negative. Now that's a square wave with a pulse width of 50%, and this PW knob here tells us what that width is. If I set that to 75, I'm going to get a different tone. It's a thinner, kind of raspier tone. So this is now more technically called a pulse wave rather than a square wave. So the pulse width knob on your oscillator gives you a wide range of different tones to play with. Don't let your ear be confused as you're hearing that sweep into thinking that there's any change of pitch. There isn't. Everything that we're hearing there is at the same pitch. We can prove that with a tuner. Everything is C. If I take it to the absolute extremes, the tuner loses the tone. It can no longer identify the tone through all the noise that's behind it. We've introduced so many artifacts to the sound, so much additional noise, all of that kind of raspiness, that the tuner can't actually identify that it's a C anymore, but it is. Now those two waveforms can be combined together to make a composite waveform. So if I click both buttons at the same time and we go back to our oscilloscope, that's a sawtooth combined with, in this case, a square wave. Pulse wave at 50%, duty cycle is a square wave. And you see a static composite wave. Take one of them away, we get back to the simple shape again. So you've got a lot of flexibility between these two waveforms and by being able to combine them together to give you all of those different flavours of sound. That's oscillator A. Wonderful. Turn that off. And now that I've turned that knob down on the mixer, no sound. Let's turn oscillator B up. So now we're looking down here, and oscillator B can do everything that oscillator A can. It's got a frequency knob to control master tuning, it's got a sawtooth knob button, it's got a pulse wave button, and it's got a pulse width knob. So those are the four settings we've got in the oscillator A. And if we turn the sawtooth wave on, we get a sawtooth. There's our square wave. There's the combination of the two, exactly the same. Oscillator B, however, also has a triangle. Looks more like a shark fin, but you know, again, this is an analog representation of a triangle wave. Pulse width has nothing to do if you're not in, if the pulse wave waveform isn't activated, doesn't do anything. If I double click on that knob, it just resets it to 50%. I can turn all three on together and we get this weird kind of composite shape between those three different waveforms. We've got a fine tune control taking us up a semitone. But the real good stuff comes when we combine those two oscillators together. So here I've set both oscillators to sawtooth mode. I've got nothing else set at all. All of my other settings are completely flat. What have we got? There's analog synthesis for you right there in a box. These two oscillators are supposed to be doing the same thing. They're supposed to be generating a sawtooth wave at the same pitch. So we shouldn't be getting any modulation of the waveform like this. Of course, there are internal or intrinsic inaccuracies in analog synthesizers, and Arturia are very good at replicating this stuff. To their credit, this isn't a criticism. This is what analog synthesis is supposed to do. And so by nature, these two oscillators are very slightly detuned from each other, even though we've not asked them to be. And because they're detuned, the waves aren't perfectly synchronized. One of them is like basically narrower than the other, which means over time it's going to happen more often, and you're going to get kind of a strobing effect as the waveforms pass between each other, and that's what you're seeing on the oscilloscope. You can accentuate that effect by turning the fine tuning control up a little bit. So now we're accentuating the difference between the tunings of the two oscillators. And we get that more exaggerated sweep. And you can hear that's as one oscillator crosses the other, because it's simply cycling faster. It's cycling 13% of a semitone, 13 cents faster than the other. And so they cross each other in a consistent but varying manner. Now, we can take that out of the equation by synchronizing the two oscillators. If I click this sync button, now the waveform is fixed. Notice this little kink. What's going on there is that when you enter sync mode, oscillator B becomes the master. It determines the pitch of the sound. Oscillator A is adding tonal colour to the sound, and I can prove that by attempting to change the frequency of oscillator A, and we won't affect the pitch of the sound at all. We get a different shape, but it's always operating at the same frequency. That's because oscillator B is determining the frequency of the tone. What's happening in sync mode is that oscillator A is determining when oscillator B re-triggers, re-fires. So when oscillator A, whatever frequency it happens to be set to, when it gets to the end of its cycle, when it's finished doing whatever it wants to do to the wave, and these two waves are being combined, don't forget, it will cause oscillator B to re-fire, to re-trigger. If I go to +1 semitone and play a note, I now have a different tone. For every frequency step I go up, I'm dramatically altering the tone of the composite wave, because oscillator A is causing oscillator B to re-trigger more often, but it's not actually fundamentally changing the nature of the pitch of the tone. That's in oscillator B's control. So that's what sync mode does. It's a little bit difficult to wrap your head around how these two oscillators are combining with each other, but if you play with the different frequencies of the two oscillators and have a look at the different shapes that the combined waves make in oscilloscopes, then you can start to gain some understanding of how sync mode works. We can detach the keyboard from oscillator 2 completely. If I just switch briefly to only oscillator B and turn this keyboard button off, I'm pressing all the white keys on my keyboard and they all make the same sound. So the keyboard button basically detaches the keyboard from the oscillator and makes it generate a fixed and static tone. Why would we want that? Well, okay, so it has an effect in its own right, but it's also used in conjunction with this low frequency button. Now when we engage low frequency mode, we turn oscillator B into a low frequency oscillator. In other words, we dramatically reduce the number of cycles that it's generating. So here I've set it up, I've turned oscillator A off, I've switched oscillator B to a simple triangle wave, I've increased the frequency as high as I can, up 24 semitones, re-engage the keyboard, we're in low frequency mode. If I now press a key on the keyboard, we're at about 30 Hertz there. So I've just played a note an octave higher, so that's about a C5 or something like that on the keyboard, but then we're adding so many other octaves on top. If I now start bringing this frequency down and shut up, I can't hear that anymore. Don't know if you can. My old ears. So now we've passed into low frequency range. It's beyond human hearing. Now low frequency oscillators suck as sound sources. You can't hear them, but they're great as modulation sources, and we'll deal with that entire area in a later video when we talk about modulation. Let's go back to standard audible frequencies. So here I've re-engaged both oscillators. I've got a sawtooth and a triangle wave, and they're combining the natural flux that's involved in a non-synchronized analog system like this. And we can also introduce a third sound source, which is noise. This is pink noise. Basically means it's got a little bit of low pass filter applied to it. Some of the higher frequencies have been thrown away. Simple as you like. You can mix that in. With your oscillators, so we have 3 independent sound sources, and that's all of the oscillator options available to us. 2 tonal oscillators, 1 pink noise generator. Those 3 can be mixed together using the mixer section, and we now have our composite oscillator tone. Each one of those tones can then be replicated over any number of voices to give us a polyphonic instrument. That's enough for today. That's the basic introduction to oscillators dealt with. In the next video we'll deal with the filter and see how that introduces colour to the sound. Thanks very much for watching. Hope to see you next time.